Hi everyone, welcome to week 4. This video I'm going to be talking about some basic information about the gospel according to Mark, and you'll read chapter 7 this week talking about the same gospel, and the chapter will go into much more depth. Before I start talking about the gospel of Mark, I do want to first of all just remind you that at the end of this week you have your first paper due. All of the topic choices are listed in the syllabi. And the paper has to be 3 to 4 pages long. You need 4 outside sources. It should be a formal paper, so you don't use any personal pronouns. And when you start the paper, you need an intro. The intro kind of looks like this, where it starts off broad and it narrows down to your topic. So please don't just start right away with talking about your topic. So let me tell you a little bit about the gospel according to Mark. Most theologians agree that this gospel was the first of its kind. Mark was the first person to write a gospel. Gospel is a story about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And I just said Mark decided this, but I want to clarify that whoever wrote this down, like physically wrote it down, is an anonymous person. And when they did write it, they were basing it off the teachings of Mark. Mark is sometimes known as John Mark in the Gospels. What we know about Mark is very minimal. He was not one of the apostles. We do know that Mark traveled with Paul, that for some reason Paul and Mark had some sort of falling out, and Mark left one of the missionary journeys that Paul was on kind of abruptly, and that Barnabas was kind of a friend of Mark's and sort of talked Paul into letting Mark join them on a later trip. We also know that he was primarily a follower or disciple of Peter, and that he got most of his information about Jesus from Peter. Also, we know Peter lived the end of his life in Rome and kind of led the church from Rome. And that's why theologians are kind of split on where they think this gospel was written. Some people think it was written in Rome because, again, most of the information came from Peter. Peter ended his life in Rome. And some theologians think that it was written more in Palestine because it certainly does reflect a lot on the violence that happened because of the Zealot revolt that led to the destruction of the temple in Palestine. And so personally, I kind of favor the latter theory, that this was more written in Palestine. Mark's gospel, again, the first one was written somewhere between 60 and 70 AD, probably closer to 65 to 70 AD. We know the temple was actually destroyed around 70 AD. Mark is writing to a bunch of Christians who are enduring a lot of suffering. And as a result, he really wants to portray Jesus as suffering also, so that these people know in the midst of this suffering that they can look to Jesus as an inspiration, that like Jesus, they can kind of be born out of or rise out of this suffering better people. And so the story is meant to kind of inspire those people who are suffering. So the audience is usually suffering Christians, and the portrait of Jesus is usually as a suffering Savior. And when I talk about each of the Gospels, I will do that. I will talk about the portrait, and I will talk about the audience. We'll talk about the place of composition and the date of composition. And again, all of this is based on a lot of study, and we don't know 100% for sure the direct answer to some of these questions. But we do know that each Gospel evangelist portrays Jesus a little bit differently, and the reason for that is they're trying to, to get the attention of a given audience, a specific group of people. Mark's gospel is the shortest gospel. It's very fast-paced. It focuses a lot on the actions that Jesus participated in, and not very much on his teachings. So there's a lot of emphasis on the different miracles that happen in Mark's gospel. Some of the main themes in Mark's gospel is that the Christian community that he's writing to is obviously under attack. That probably is because of the Christian persecutions. And those started with Nero, and they started both in Rome and Palestine. But again, the violence that the Romans kind of exhibited toward the early Christians and Jewish people happened in Palestine. Also, there's kind of this reoccurring theme where the apostles really tend to misunderstand what Jesus is saying and his whole purpose. It's a little comical. It takes halfway through the gospel before even Peter says, you're the Messiah. And that happens around chapter 8, and it's kind of positioned, I would say intentionally this way, but there's a story of Jesus healing a blind man. And then right after that, Peter's talking to Jesus, and he's saying, people are saying all these things about you. And then Jesus says, well, who do you say I am? And it's at that moment that this light bulb is above Peter's head, and he realizes that Jesus is the Messiah. So he heals someone's physical blindness and then Peter's spiritual blindness. And from there forward, he's convinced, but it takes still a while for the rest of them to understand. And so this misunderstanding of the apostles is pretty clear. Another thing that's true is that Jesus tries to keep his messiahship a secret. This is known as the messianic secret. And for whatever reason, when he heals people, or like in the example of the transfiguration, when he goes up on a mountain with some of the apostles, on the way down, he says, don't tell anyone what you saw, or don't tell anyone what I did. And there's a lot of theories as to why he might have wanted to keep this a secret. Probably the most popular opinion is that he knew when he got to Jerusalem that would be the time for him to sacrifice his life. And he was kind of trying to delay large crowds of people to gather, because that would call attention to the Romans that he was maybe a threat to their rule. Another thing, if you're going to be a disciple of Jesus according to the Gospel of Mark, that means you have to forget yourself. You have to give up everything. You have to be willing to carry your own cross and to go through your own suffering. There is also a theme of what we call the immediate parousia. The parousia is the second coming of Jesus. And with the immediate parousia, we believe, or the gospel writer believed, that Jesus' second coming was going to happen at any given moment. And so everything is, done immediately and has to happen quickly, because this second coming will quickly happen. There's what they would say about this gospel is there's a low Christology. Christology is referring to how you portray Jesus, either human or divine. And so a low Christology would be more of a focus on the human Jesus, and a high Christology would be more of a focus on the divine Jesus. And so Mark's gospel is really, although he claims that Jesus is the Messiah, it's focused more on his work here on earth and, how he is fulfilling that on earth. A preferred title for Jesus in Mark's gospel is Son of Man, which would have been something that Jewish people would have been familiar with. There are several passages that show that the author of this gospel highlights moments with Jesus and where he is expelling demons, where he is dealing with kind of evil spirits. Okay, so that you see a lot in this as well. In Mark's gospel, most of the action happens up in Galilee and where Jesus was raised by Nazareth. But as soon as he starts heading toward Jerusalem, that's when he's heading to his crucifixion. Mark's gospel did end kind of abruptly with the women who went to anoint his body, finding his tomb empty and being afraid to go tell everyone. You'll see if you look in the Bible that there's a few stories that were kind of later added to Mark's gospel. One more thing that I think is interesting to note is that in the reading you'll read about this man who's clothed in a loincloth that appears a few times kind of mysteriously and seems to know a lot about Jesus. There is a section of this gospel that's known as the secret gospel of Mark that was pulled out of the gospel and was read at early Christian baptisms. And so it was probably pulled out because they wanted to keep some of their rituals secret during the Christian persecutions. But it is interesting because people have been a little thrown off by this almost naked man who kind of appears periodically. And the reason that he would have been, barely dressed is because at a baptism in the early church, you would have taken off all your clothes, gotten into the waters, been baptized, and then received a new white garment to show kind of this new life and shedding your old life of sin and death. And so that person is theorized at least to be someone who was baptized by Jesus. So anyway, I hope you enjoy reading about the Gospel of Mark, and good luck on your papers.